Okay, so private drainage systems, and I'm specifically talking a lot now about the agricultural ones. So they consist of a series of lateral drains that are installed across the field. You should be able to see in the schematic those dashed lines. And those are meant to really manage the water table, to collect excess soil water into those 4-inch lateral pipes. They're typically 4 inches in size. They're at a set depth, a set spacing, and we'll get into that a little bit to understand if you'd like. But they're installed to basically provide under draining for that agricultural field. All of those individual laterals are collecting that water, are then brought into a main drain, and that main drain ultimately brings the water from the farm, from the field, to an outlet. And again, we need to have a legal and sufficient outlet. So one there we're allowed to discharge the water, and one that has sufficient capacity to not cause damage downstream. These private systems may also include surface water drainage features such as berms and swales, or even direct inlet connections. And there's a number of inlets, Hickenbottoms, and things that can occur out on an agricultural field in certain locations for certain needs to collect surface water directly and pipe it into the system rather than allowing it to drain through the soil. And we can get into what that looks like a little bit more in subsequent slides here. So again, how does it work? So I'm not sure again of the background, but just so everyone's on the same page here, it works essentially like holes in a flower pot, right? So it provides drainage from the rainwater that hits the surface and infiltrates into the water table, and ultimately drains through those laterals into the main drains. And its primary purpose is to remove that excess gravitational water from the root zone. So typically in Ontario, they're installed anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5, maybe 4 feet deep at most, depending upon the topography and the soil type. And it's really meant to drain that excess water above the tile to make a properly aerated, properly drained root zone to allow the available water that's still there in the soil. The soil doesn't get dried out from tile drainage. It only removes excess gravitational water. And the water that remains in the soil is available through capillary reaction into the crops through the root uptake. On the bottom, you'll see a little bit of a picture here again where you have the tile drains installed below the root zone. The tile drain spacing is again the distance between those laterals that are installed across the field. And ultimately the collector is the drain that is larger in size, deeper than the laterals, that collects all of those individual laterals and provides the water to the outlet, in this case, the roadside ditch. So let's take a look at how this works through a quick little series of slides here as well. Okay, so water level drops below the tile. The tile does not flow. So the tiles themselves don't suck water in. It only is an outlet for gravitational water that's above the bottom of the tile. So when the tile is no longer have water above it, the tile drainage flow stops. Crops are supplied with water via capillary reaction in that soil. So that soil where the roots are is not dry, but it has the excess soil removed. So there's a mixture of air as well as water. When it starts to rain, soil infiltration can occur. And again, there's not necessarily any tile flow until the water table itself starts to rise higher than the tile. So in this case here, there's very little runoff and the soil is storing water. And that's where we get into this idea of, with a properly drained field, there is some storage capacity built in to absorb some of these smaller rainfall events by not allowing surface water runoff to occur, by really promoting infiltration, which is important from an environmental perspective as well. Any water that goes out of the tile outlet is being filtered to some degree through the soil. And that's a really important point to think about in terms of environmentally. So as the rain continues, we can see now that the water has gone above the tile drains, those lateral drains. And so we start to get tiles, outlets flowing. And we'll see that there's an increase as well in the roadside ditch in this particular case, and that the roadside ditch acts in a similar manner as the tile, right? So there's going to be tile outlet flowing into that ditch. There's going to be some other runoff potentially from other places if there's pavement and roads flowing into that roadside ditch. And as well, there's seepage coming in from the ground adjacent to the edge of the ditch as well. One thing to just note here in general, my schematic is a little bit off here. We ideally, when we have farmers installing tile drainage outlets, they really are meant to be above the typical water level in the outlet, above the ditch. This particular one, I'm showing a submerged outlet, which does occur, but it's not really a best practice. But just for my picture, I couldn't really draw it quickly to change that. So I just want to point that out as well. Okay, rain continues again. It could be a very high intense thunderstorm where the rate of infiltration isn't high enough to absorb all the water. And so we end up getting now either a soil saturation condition or a very, very high top level of the soil being saturated where we now get runoff. So tiles are flowing as well as we have surface water beginning to flow into the ditch. The rain ends, and so does our surface water runoff eventually. Of course, there may be a bit of a tailing to that, depending how much water is ponded on the surface, so that may continue for a little bit. But eventually what happens is we have the tiles now being the primary transport mechanism for the water. So the tile is still flowing. You can see that there's water in the root zone. And if that was left in an undrained field, that could cause root damage and delay in crop productivity and yield if that water is left for 24 hours or more. So the tile drainage systems really now start to function and do their work, if you will, by draining that extra gravitational water out typically in 24 hours to allow the roots to continue to grow, to get the oxygen and the CO2 transfer that they need to be healthy and grow. Okay, so we see the water continuing to be drawn down. Keeps doing here. You'll notice that the tile is still flowing here in this case, and now we have reduction in the amount of water in the ditch because the ditch has been also having its own hydrology happen. And you can see that the tile is draining the water most over the tile itself. So you'll see these sort of mounds, if you will, in between the two tiles, and that's very typical. The highest water table elevation is always the midpoint between the two laterals as we have a functioning drainage system going. And it's essentially going to keep dropping until it reaches again where our starting point was, where the water is below the tile drain elevation. This time of year, you may have seen on either driving the landscape or some drone photos or Google aerial maps and things like that, where you see these bands of light, small strips across farmers' fields and a darker section in the middle. And sometimes aerial photography or drones can capture this exact picture from the surface. And what you're seeing is the lighter colored bands are actually the tile laterals, and they're the drier sections above the pipe, and the darker zones in between those are actually the wetter middle areas where the water table is higher. So there are times of the year that you can actually fly and get aerial photography to identify the locations of these agricultural drainage systems. It's actually quite effective. Okay, so again, we have continued gravitational water being pulled down until it eventually slows down and it reaches the tile level. And we have the tile flow ending. And so now again, the system is ready and it's on standby waiting for the next rainfall. There's no tile outlet flow at this point because the water table is below the drains themselves. Okay, so that's the way the system functions effectively, and it cycles through that over and over and over again. Of course, the amount of rain input, the size of the system, et cetera, will depend on the time frame for which that occurs. But as I said, typically they're meant to be designed for removing the excess soil water within 24 hours. Okay. So a couple things to talk about. How does the design of these agricultural drainage systems come about? So on the far right, you'll see just a fictitious example here. The blue lines being those laterals being installed across the farmer's field. The red line is the main drain, as I mentioned, that collects the water from those laterals, takes the water from the field to the outlet. In this particular case, it's a municipal drain system number 1, could be a natural water course, etc. And there's some details around standard design practices. And I'll talk about those in a few minutes, but they are essentially coming from the Drainage Guide for Ontario, publication 29. So farmers can install their own drainage systems. OMAFR certainly recommends that they hire a licensed contractor to do the design and installation. But the reality is, you can see from that map, all of those blue dots are licensed contractors that OMAFRA trains, inspects, and licenses. And so the area in which we're talking to here, your geography, has a limited number of contractors. And so it is challenging for farmers to find contractors who have the ability to come in and do the work. There may be a bit of a backlog or delay on getting a contractor in because of that geography and because of the limited number of contractors. All of the farmers or contractors should be following publication 29. The contractors actually have an obligation because that guide is referenced in our licensing legislation. So they're obligated to, and we get complaints and we actually go and do inspections to ensure that systems, when they're installed by our licensed contractors, are meeting the requirements of that guide. So some things like drain depth, minimum cover, guidance around what is the appropriate spacing and depth based upon the soil and crop type, those sorts of things are all found in that drainage guide. And then ultimately the design is done in terms of the specifics on each individual property. So how is the system laid out is dependent upon the topography, the field geometry, and farming practices as well. We want to make sure that we, as we mentioned, maintain these systems properly. So we don't want to have, farming operation where they're running over top of the main drain with heavy equipment during harvest, where they could be damaged to that pipe, which would then result in reduction in capacity of the system. So it's really important that the contractor or the farmer considers all of these technical pieces of information as well as their farming practices to design and install a system that's going to meet the needs for themselves into the future. Okay, so let's move on then from there. The thing I want to talk about now, then a little bit more of interest here is the outlets, right? So we talked a little bit about how does these outlets interface, and so we don't have a lot of drains under the Drainage Act in the geography where you guys are all from. And so there are various outlet possibilities for these systems. Certainly they can include, as we mentioned, illegal outlet situations where people are outletting at the property line. I know that does occur. I get phone calls often asking for people for information and how can I help them. So those do occur, of course, and it really is an issue of common law for the most part between neighbors, and it's really they're really challenging to resolve, unfortunately. We can have natural water courses, as I mentioned, and we've covered what that looks like. Am I an abutting riparian landowner? Do I have the right to drain into that natural water course? If I'm not a property owner that is abutting a natural water course, and I'm, let's say, one property up from that natural water course, I may not have the inherent right to drain into that natural water course, but if I'm in the watershed, there are ways in which I may be able to get my water there legally. So that's what we'll talk a little bit about, this idea of drains created under statute, and we'll talk through those in a little bit. And then, of course, in many cases, the roadside ditch is a very seemingly easy, convenient way of discharging your private agricultural drainage system into. But of course, I want to talk a little bit more about that in detail in terms of what are the rights of the individuals. First of all, the properties who want to discharge, what are the rights of the municipalities or the road authorities in terms of do I have to take the water, et cetera. So let's walk through that a little bit here in the next few slides. So outlets in the roadside ditches, with the road authority's consent, which is typically the municipality, they can be used as an outlet for these private drainage systems. However, under the common law, municipalities, like any other property owner, have no obligation to accept the water or allow the connection to the roadside ditch. It really is a matter of choice on the municipality's side of things, because the roadside ditch is a private drainage system owned by the municipality or the road authority for the purposes of providing drainage to the road. And so it's no different than a farmer using a neighbor's tile or ditch. The roadside ditch needs permission and approval from the owner, which in this case is typically the municipality. So across the province, there's a few different approaches. Some municipalities allow connections without any conditions or approval. They literally say, yeah, do whatever you want. And that's one approach. It's not the greatest one in my opinion, but that does happen. Some municipalities allow connections with conditions and approval requirements, which is certainly a good way to go in terms of being neighborly, making sure if possible we can meet the needs of our property owners who are adjacent to the road, but making sure that the drain is protected, the road is protected. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And some municipalities have an outright ban. They absolutely will not accept any water directly connected into the roadside ditch. It's important to kind of think about this one, though, in terms of this idea of collected versus uncollected, right? So the reality is if I'm adjacent to a road and my property is higher than the road or the roadside ditch, water will naturally flow downhill and the road will likely have limited choice in accepting that water from sheet flow, from natural drainage, but it's the collection and discharge that they're going to have more control over in terms of those connections, right? So again, those illegal connections do happen since water does flow downhill naturally. And even on the roadside ditch, regulatory permits may be required if the ditch is actually a regulated watercourse under the Conservation Authorities Act or Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So it really depends on how close you are and how connected you are to Lake Ontario, as an example. There can be private roadside ditches that actually are regulated and they're actually fish habitat through the Fisheries Act, particularly for spawning and things like that, where certain salmonoids come up into these ditches. So again, roadside ditches can either be a private drain for the purpose of draining the road. They could be part of a mutual agreement drain. We're going to talk about what is a mutual agreement drain in a little bit. Or they can be a drain under the Drainage Act. So there's sort of three different options for a roadside ditch. Recognizing that roadside ditches, you know, they're not really natural water courses. There could be a natural water course next to a road, but it's not a roadside ditch. Then it's a natural water course. So if the municipality is willing to allow these connections, some things to think about is approval needed for each connection, right? So do you want to see every single connection come before the municipality for approval? Or should a policy be developed related to the issue that would allow, you know, permitting by rule, so to speak? There's lots of options for that. In an individual specific scenario is, does the roadside ditch have enough spare capacity? As I mentioned, it's designed to handle the road drainage. Does it have enough spare capacity to handle that extra water from the private system wishing to connect to the roadside ditch? Was the roadside ditch designed to handle any extra flow of all the adjacent properties, right? So you may have one request and you say, yeah, this sounds good. We can handle that capacity. Let's approve it. And then you get a subsequent property owner that says, actually, I want to do the same thing my neighbor did. Why aren't you going to let me? And the question is, well, the ditch could handle the one property. Now it can't handle the second property. Is there a fairness issue? Is there a policy issue there in terms of understanding the implications of multiple properties wishing to drain into the roadside ditch? Is the ditch deep enough to allow connection by the private system, right? So each individual property, depending on their soil type, is going to need to install their laterals at a certain depth. Some are 2.5 feet deep, some are 4 feet deep, depending on the soil. So how deep is your ditch in comparison to how deep it needs to be for that system to connect into the roadside ditch? Again, the roadside ditch doesn't have an obligation to accept the water, so they don't have to make the roadside ditch deeper, but they can, right? That's some of the options around being neighborly versus what are my legal rights. Would the connection or the extra water create a potential issue with the road drainage? Would it create stability issue in the subsurface if it's saturated? Would it create flooding of the road? These are obviously important things as road authorities to manage, to make sure that you're not compromising your primary role as a road authority by taking on this extra water. And then if you're willing to accept it, you know, what conditions should the municipality attach to all and each of these approvals? And we'll talk a little bit about some examples of what those conditions might look like depending on the route that a municipality may choose to go if they want to provide outlet through the ditch. The other thing to think about here is that the road authority will assume liability for potential damages that could be caused downstream if they accept the water. You may recall in an earlier slide, I talked about if the road has a culvert passing water from one side of the road under the road to the other side and property damage occurs or crop damage occurs downstream, the road doesn't have the obligation to accept the water, but once they do, they're now liable as well as the upstream owners for causing damage because they've accepted that water. So similarly, you have to be aware here, if you're going to allow someone to use a roadside ditch, even if your roadside ditch goes into a natural water course, as you can see on the right-hand side here, we have a roadside ditch that brings water into the natural water course. Property B, in this particular case, was either illegally or given permission to discharge their tile drainage system into the roadside ditch. In this particular example, property B was even outside of the watershed, but it could even be in the watershed. And that extra water has now caused flooding down in the bottom, sort of middle, lower property owner C. And the question is, could that be caused by the actions of property owner B through the roadside ditch, bringing in extra water into the natural water course? And that really is a question of liability. It's a question before the courts, but it's something that road authorities need to be aware of when they're allowing water to come into the roadside ditch. They are now also ultimately taking on some of that liability for that water downstream as well, even though they weren't the initial generators of the surface water. So an important piece to consider in that regard. Okay, so how do you go about then doing this? So again, if you were going to allow them, the property owners, to collect and discharge water into the roadside ditch, this idea of no approvals, or approvals with conditions, etc. Mutual agreement drains are a really good mechanism to formalize what is being agreed to. What does the system look like? Who's paying for it? All those sorts of things. And so mutual agreement drains are actually under the Drainage Act. They're not petition drains. I will talk about petition drains in a couple slides in the minute. But mutual agreement drains are private drainage systems that are authorized, constructed, improved, financed, owned, maintained through a written agreement. And they're defined under Section 2 of the Drainage Act. And there's 7 specific things that need to be put in place in that written agreement for them to be a mutual agreement drain. So they have to reference the Drainage Act, legally describe the lands, the estimated cost of the drainage system, provide a description of the system, and then talk about cost share. Who's going to pay for the cost of construction? Who's going to pay for future maintenance and repair? And then execute the agreement with a date and signatures, and then an affidavit of a witness to the execution of the agreement. So that's the legal basis for what a mutual agreement drain is. And it's a private agreement between 2 or more property owners, and it's binding on those 2 or more signatures. And a municipality can be a signature to a mutual agreement drain. I'll walk through what that looks like in a moment. So this agreement may or may not be registered on title. If it is not registered on title, then it's a contract that needs to be adhered to by the signatories, and the courts are the mechanism to get relief if someone isn't living up to their obligations. And as soon as property is transferred and sold, a new owner is not bound by this particular agreement unless the original agreement is registered on property that both signatories agree to. So if you're going to get an agreement and you want to make sure you have the right, even if your neighbor sells their property, it's best to have it registered on property title so every future owner is agreeing to that when they purchase the property, because you'll actually find it through a property transaction search process with a real estate agent and a lawyer. Okay, so that's what a mutual agreement drain is in definition. So some things that you're going to want to consider if you're going to do a mutual agreement drain as well is the technical details of the drain. So make sure, where is it located? What is the elevation of the ditch bottom? Are there side slope requirements? Are there vegetation requirements? The details of who oversees the construction, and who oversees the permitting obligations. For future maintenance work, how is notification of future maintenance work done? Who does all the arrangements for that work? How are the costs allocated for the future maintenance and repair? And then also things that protect the drain from future changes. So statements such as, no other property owner can connect into the private farm system that's using the municipal roadside ditch as an outlet, as an example, are things that could protect each individual person on that agreement. So as a resource, OMAFRA has a mutual agreement drains fact sheet that has sort of the process of doing this, as well as walking through some tips and suggested practices if individuals are interested in doing this. And this can be, again, between private property owners, farmer and farmer, farmer and municipality, etc. So some of the advantages of the mutual agreement drains is that they're usually cheaper than drains under the Drainage Act. So if you can agree to this, it's certainly more cost effective than petitioning for a drain under the Drainage Act. It's, again, under the Drainage Act, but a different section. And property owners really have the direct ability to negotiate the conditions and the cost sharing arrangements with all parties. And if it's registered on property title, then again, it's binding on future property. So it does have that permanentness if it's registered. Some disadvantage of the mutual agreement drains: if it's not engineered properly, property owners are liable for any design flaws. So you can certainly get mutual agreement drains to be engineered and hire an engineer to do the design, or they could be agreed to by the property owners. And then if one property owner fails to comply with the terms of the agreement, the only way to get recourse is through the courts by the other party. So if it says you must maintain this when we notify you, and the property owner says I'm not doing it or I'm not paying for it, unfortunately, then you're going to have to go through the courts system to do that. Where the Drainage Act process for a petition drain, which I'll walk through in a minute, is a different process. Okay, so again, this is the mechanism of mutual agreement drains for getting outlet for these private systems. The petition drain process is really the meat and potatoes, if you will, of the Drainage Act. And it's really about solving private drainage issues through a collaborative process where a property owner petitions the municipality. The lower tier municipality is the one responsible for the administration of the process. And essentially then they go through this process to allow the creation of, and then ultimately improvements to and maintenance of drains. And some of the advantages of that, they need to appoint an engineer. So drains that are done this way are professionally designed, and the cost sharing is done by the engineer who has experience in these activities. It also is a very collaborative process, so it allows multiple points in the process that property owners have input into the process to say, here's my drainage needs, here's my concerns. Regulatory agencies are also involved to say, here's our concern with regards to environmental impacts, water management, et cetera. So the Conservation Authority, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, et cetera. But it's also a very powerful process. While it's collaborative, at the end of the day, the municipality adopts the engineer's report that is being developed for the drain. It's adopted by bylaw, and so it's authorized by law now. And so it allows entry onto private property for the purposes of constructing and maintaining the drain. But at the same time, it has independent appeal bodies that are able to be accessed by property owners to ensure that their at least voice is heard if it wasn't heard in the first collaborative process to an appeal body. And then the interesting part is, again, the costs of these systems are assessed out by the engineer, and they're paid for by the property owners in the watershed. So everyone that benefits from the drain pays a portion, and everyone in the watershed that actually has land that receives rainfall that contributes water to the issue also pays what's called outlet liability. So again, this is that idea of surface water that falls as rain does not have a natural right to drainage unless it's modified by statute law. The Drainage Act takes that common law principle and modifies it and allows everyone in the watershed to buy into the right of drainage. So now you've made a drainage system that has a watershed and everyone pays and has a right to use it, similar to the natural water courses and riparian landowners who abut a natural water course. So then the municipality has to do that process. They also have authority to oversee the maintenance and repair of that infrastructure to allow it to continue functioning as it was designed. And then one last little key piece here is in the Drainage Act, the definition of drainage works is it includes a drain constructed by any means. And so this is an important piece because it's very broad. And so you can get into even adding environmental features into a drain and have that incorporated in. So buffers can be incorporated into a drainage works. Offline storage, for water retention, for habitat features, for water quality features, et cetera, as well as agricultural usages can be incorporated into a drain constructed under the Drainage Act. So it's very broad in terms of what is a drain. I wanted to look real quick here. This I'm not sure if this is certainly one of the very few drains in the area. This is the Welcome Municipal Drain. Just outside of Welcome, which I've never been there personally, but I just pulled it up on our Ag Map site. It's outside of Port Hope itself. What I wanted to just highlight here on this map is you'll see the dark purple and the sort of more light purple hatching. And those are all properties that have a tile drainage record completed by a contractor, submitted to a MAFRA, and we upload that information. So you can see there's a fair bit of agricultural properties here that have tile drainage. I don't remember which one's which. One of the colors is a systematic, so a complete field drainage system. The other one is a random system, which means basically somewhere on that property are some drains put in place, but it wasn't done for the entire property. So that's the difference between the colors. But what I wanted to just flag here, even here, we have one municipal drain in Port Hope, Welcome Municipal Drain. You can see where the drain flows across properties, that there's going to be direct connections to that drain being made by those property owners. And then the question becomes, as you go broader outside of that, is how do those other properties get connections or outlets for their agricultural tile drainage systems? So in this case here, I wanted to just highlight the fact that in order to get access to that Welcome Municipal Drain, all of these properties may, and I don't know the watershed, but they may be contributing the costs to that drain. They may be benefiting from it. They may be paying outlet liability. But the reality is they need to get their water still from their property across other properties to the drain if they want to connect to it. And so that's where you still end up with, roadside ditches could be still used as an outlet because the road likely, that highway or road 74, I'm sure, outlets into the welcome municipal drain. And so if someone asks the municipality, can I drain my land into your roadside ditch and then ultimately to the municipal drain, that is going to be a potential mechanism to get the water there. Or they could look at going across another farmer's field and their property to get access to the municipal drain. So the big picture here is, even with municipal drains, there's still these other properties that need to make their own legal case to connect into the natural water course or to connect into the municipal drain. So the municipal drain is not the end all be all as far as solving everyone's needs, but it certainly is the right step in many cases to get that communal drainage system put together. The other thing I'm just going to say as well, in terms of Pam's comments at the start, the fact that a municipal drain is a watershed based approach, it really makes the engineer look at the whole system and try to design it so all of the water is collected and taken to a sufficient outlet where it doesn't cause damage downstream, as opposed to one-off properties draining and doing their own thing. There is a harder time to aggregate and collaborate to make sure you're not causing those issues downstream when it's not done in a systematic manner. So just something to think about as well when you're doing them not in the Drainage Act side of things. Okay. So what I want to just walk through, this is sort of my last little bit before I open it up to questions, is, again, this idea of how does somebody get drainage? So there's that municipal drain. It could be the welcome municipal drain in Port Hope. It could be another one, or it could be a natural water course for that matter. And what I wanted to sort of work through here is this example of, sorry, bear with me for 1 second. There we go. This example here where I have property owner A, an agricultural field property, and they don't have a tile drainage system in, but they want to put one in, right? So they're in a position where they want to improve their yield. They've done the research. They understand that they can get, a 10%, 20% increase in yield on their existing property. They want to put the system in. So let's propose they're going to hire a contractor to do it. They need an outlet though, right? So they're kind of landlocked here. There's the township road to the south of them. There's a couple of properties, A and B and C downstream, and there's a municipal drain or a natural water course. So before the contractor really comes on site to do the work, the contractor needs to understand where is my legal and then sufficient outlet, right? So they're going to identify that municipal drain as their outlet. How do I get there? So first of all, am I in the watershed? If the answer is yes, I've already paid into the right. I'm paying outlet liability. I'm in the watershed. I have the right to put my water into that drain, but I have to figure out how do I legally get it there. Okay, so I could do a couple things, and I'll walk through this as an example, but it's really important that the farmer and the contractor gets this resolved before the work starts, so we don't have a situation where the contractor and the farmer are dumping the water at the edge of the property boundary between A and B and causing issues. Okay, so this is the right way to do things. Okay, so the first thing is the owner of property A could approach the neighboring property owners, which is option 1, to go across B and C property there to see if we could get a mutual agreement drain. Okay, so that's one option. Does that work? Well, if that doesn't work, I could potentially petition a drain for a branch extension from that municipal drain to get to my property A. And that's always an option that property owner A can do to the municipality, say I need an extension or I need a drain from that natural water course to my property. Okay, so that's always there. But the other option I wanted to kind of tie in here is, let's say property owners B and C, or not both of them, agree to this mutual agreement. The option 2 exists where the property owner could go to the municipality and ask for permission for a mutual agreement drain for that roadside ditch. They could ask for permission to just put it in the roadside ditch, but the other option could be to be more formal agreement between the municipality is for a mutual agreement drain. Okay, so again, no obligation on behalf of the municipality or the road authority to take that water. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But at the end of the day, option 3 would still exist for property owner A to petition for a drain. So again, is it better to agree to a mutual agreement drain? That's obviously case by case basis, up to the municipality, up to the road authority, and the specifics of that situation. But if you were going to do a mutual agreement drain, some of the things to think about in this scenario are, so for example, let's go back to option 1 where property owners B and C agree to this. So the mutual agreement drain is going to want to look at what is the size of the pipe going across B and C. Should it be a pipe? Are they agreeable to a ditch? A ditch is cheaper, but do they want an open ditch across their property? What size should the pipe be? Is anybody else on property B or C interested in using that pipe? Because if they are, what should be the cost share arrangement? Who's using what percentage of the pipe size capacity? Those sorts of questions need to be considered when you're doing a private property sort of mutual agreement. When we look a little bit now with regards to the road authority, we've talked on some of these sort of issues, but some of the questions become, if the municipality is agreeable, again, confirming that the increased capacity exists in the roadside ditch to accommodate the drainage needs of property A, as well as, of course, the township road. Who oversees the construction? Does the municipality want to oversee it and charge that back out to the property owner? Who pays for any changes that need to happen to that roadside ditch, right? Can the roadside ditch as it is accept it? Or does there need to be some work done to actually allow that extra water into the roadside ditch and to get it safely without affecting the road to the outlet? And then ultimately, who agrees to pay for the maintenance costs? How is notification required? Does the road just undertake it automatically and bill property owner A, or is there other mechanisms in place? So these are the things to think about in terms of if this was an option to undertake a mutual agreement drain with a municipality to receive water from a private system adjacent to the road. Okay. So I think that is essentially about it. I do have a couple slides. One is resources. Again, I will provide this slide deck through Pam to those that were on this in the session. So the Drainage Act itself, we have a link on ontario.ca on our e-laws site. As well, we have a lot of information, various fact sheets and other pages drainage related on our ontario.ca/drainage website. So information on the Drainage Act in general, on common law, on conflict of surface water between neighbors, information on mutual agreement drains. That fact sheet I mentioned is on there. As well, I'll highlight here the Canadian Legal Information Institute, which does have those case law on there from all Canadian courts, as well as the provincial tribunals and the drainage referee as well. And then an important resource that we do have outside of our ontario.ca/drainage website is our agricultural information atlas, or ag maps. And there's the link there. And on there, you can find all sorts of information related to soils, drainage, and other government information as well. So roads, and there's a bunch of other things on there that may be useful for you to look at a particular location that you might be dealing with a private system being in place. And then the last slide is just my contact information, my email and my work phone number. And I'm happy to have email or phone conversations on topics related to drainage as they come up.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. This is much, much appreciated. A lot to cover, but you did a great job. I followed along with most of it. Thank you again for doing this for us.
My pleasure.